Hi, I'm Donovan. I'm going to be reading a little bit more from my life's work, Sex and Sacrament. This will be the rest of Chapter 1. Brief introduction to ordinary prayer as one of 4 experiences of embodied prayer. Ordinary prayer, which has got 2 kinds, meditation and ecstasy. The 16th century mystic Teresa of Avila, I was talking about a little bit yesterday, described the most common experience of prayer, ordinary prayer, most of the time for most people who pray, as mental prayer. In other words, this is the prayer that we do, most people who try to pray do most often. This mental prayer is simply a way of praying attentively, speaking to God, consciously remembering we're in God's presence, thinking of words communicated to God, thinking about who God is and who we are, trying to discover more about God, and just staying with God in whatever way we can. That's ordinary prayer. One of Teresa's key suggestions related to this beginning practice of mentally focused prayer was not to address God while you're thinking of other things, but instead to make an effort to focus your thoughts on God alone. Other meditation traditions that are thousands of years old also recognize that this kind of focus and sustained concentration take a long time and consistent practice for most of us to develop. So here I'm thinking about like the 8 limbs of yoga, Buddhist meditation, Zen meditation in the Buddhist tradition. So usually we start in those traditions that how can I say, comfort us by saying, hey, it takes a long time to learn to focus and concentrate like that. That usually we actually have to begin by just being aware of our bodies first and our breath. So in the Christian tradition, when the most widely recognized teacher of prayer, Teresa of Avila, says, well, just focus your thoughts. I just wanted to share. It's not that simple, even though this is ordinary prayer in the beginning stage of prayer. Even in most of the traditions, starting with words is usually where we begin. Although mental prayer is often suggested for those just beginning their practice of prayer in any tradition, we sometimes begin to experience contemplation or meditation, the more advanced stages, that more focused and quiet way of prayer, even in vocal or mental prayer, just by trying to become aware or mindful of the one to whom we speak. And in many traditions, that one to whom we speak in prayer would be God. Some ways we can try mental prayer include, but are not limited to, vocal prayer, meditation or reflection, and prayers of the heart that include an emotional response, such as meditating on the life of Jesus or one of our spiritual heroes, even using pictures or readings or even music to help us focus. We could have a focus word, or it could be a mantra, it could be a Bible verse. Devotional reading of scriptures as prayer, reading together, reading the sacred texts, is a form of mental prayer, and we'll try that together pretty soon. Regardless of which tools we use in mental prayer, this type of prayer is a way to focus our inner gaze lovingly and attentively on God, thinking of God and God's presence as much as we can, even if we're confused or distracted. The Indian teacher who's taught me the most about living prayer, not just thinking prayer, but really living as a prayer, assures us constant repetition of God's name, even without feelings of devotion, in anger or lethargy, brings out his grace. Once this is realized, there's no room for any misgivings. In other words, no matter how we pray and no matter how we're feeling while we pray, the prayer is still effective. As we get more familiar with practicing prayer and meditation, our goal is to let go of trying to control it so much, to allow feelings and thoughts of God just to come to us intuitively or imaginatively. Some people are especially drawn to this more vocal and mental kind of prayer, though, particularly if they have a distaste for meditation, and that's okay. So just because some traditions will say, oh, this is the beginning way of prayer, it doesn't mean it's wrong. It doesn't mean it's less good or anything like that. So some folks just don't like meditation, and most teachers, most traditions, they recognize that meditation is not for everybody. This is a fun kind of prayer, and you can stay with it. If this is your preferred kind of prayer, it's great to pray this way all the time, your whole life. This is the only kind of prayer perhaps you'll need or want to explore. In her spiritual autobiography, Teresa equated this mental or vocal experience of prayer with a well, in which much effort's required to draw up the water. In this case, the water is feeling a connection to God. This kind of prayer takes a lot more effort than some other forms of prayer, effort from us to feel that connection. So this effort could include both, it usually includes both us letting go of our pride so that we can experience God's presence come to us in humility. In other words, letting go of pride in this kind of prayer is recognizing that regardless of what I'm doing, I'm not, at some point it helps if I stop focusing on what I'm saying and how I'm saying it and start focusing on God, right? And so that part is the humility part. And also then the second thing in this that takes effort in this kind of prayer is to remain faithful or consistent to the habit of prayer, even when we feel discouraged because we seem like we're not getting any results, or we're not feeling that connection, or I don't feel God there. Doesn't mean there's anything wrong with our prayer. It just means that the act of prayer is feeling like it takes a lot more work when it's we're not getting that juicy sweet feeling from it. So this kind of mental prayer, even though it may be common to beginners, actually requires the greatest amount of work of any form of prayer. So again, just by no means, just because we call it ordinary, just means it's ordinary in the case that this is the most usual, typical, common one. It doesn't mean it's wrong in any way, shape, or form. It's good. Prayer is good. So to make it a little easier to try out, we're going to apply this imaginative practice of mental and vocal prayer that takes a lot of hard work to a really familiar prayer. In this case, again, because I wrote this text have come up primarily in Christian traditions, we'll be using the Lord's Prayer, which is a prayer taught by Jesus based on a traditional Jewish prayer. Anyway, it's a pretty familiar prayer in a lot of different contexts, but feel free to substitute a prayer that's familiar to you. I'll practice in these YouTube episodes with that particular one, but you can apply this to any prayer, mantra, anything that helps you connect with God. So we'll follow one reason I chose the Lord's Prayer is not just because it's familiar to a certain number of folks that I may be connected with, but also because Teresa of Avila gave suggestions on praying that one using these special mental prayer tools. She gave directions on that to her own community of sisters, so we can use her suggestions and see what kind of experience that brings. I've done that with a lot of folks over the years, and it's been kind of a fresh way to experience a prayer that maybe some of us don't always experience in a fresh way anymore. Some folks know it by rote, or maybe they learned it when they were so little they never really thought about what the words meant or how it could feel. So this will give a chance to connect with it in that more imaginative and intuitive and emotive kind of way. The 3 or 4 kinds of prayer that Teresa experienced and taught to others have a lot of overlap. You can cycle back and forth in between these different kinds of prayer. They're called sometimes stages, but it doesn't mean that they're linear or progressive or that one is better than another. So just think of it more like a spiral or a cycle or something like that. Anyway, so before we jump into mental prayer practice together, here's a little intro to some of her ideas and experiences of these different types of prayer that we're going to explore together over time and how they relate to each other. So the first one we've already started talking about, ordinary prayer or mental prayer. It's often been called the first stage or most common kind of prayer, even in, not just by Teresa, but in other traditions as well. The prayer of simplicity, it's sometimes called. It's the most accessible to the most people. It includes vocal prayer and meditation, reflection, reading, prayers of the heart. In other words, this is an intuitive, emotional, or heart prayer that simply gazes with loving attention at God. We think chiefly of God and of God's presence, but often in a confused, undisciplined, unfamiliar, unpracticed way, which, as I was quoting Neem Karoli Baba earlier, it's not necessarily a bad thing. We're thinking about God. That's not a bad thing. If we're thinking about it while we're distracted and angry or half asleep, I know we all have opinions about that, but some of the greatest teachers on prayer and people who lived the most faithfully kept reminding us, you know what, as long as you're communicating with God and your attention is on God somehow, some kind of way, even if you're just saying the words, but your mind's kind of floating off somewhere else, it's still, you're orienting yourself in the right direction and the result's going to be good. So trust yourself. You're willing to pray. You don't have to be perfect. You're trying to connect with God. That's a good thing. Some people are drawn to this kind of prayer, this vocal, mental kind of prayer, particularly if they don't like quiet meditation, as we said before. One historical example of mental prayer that has been very common to the life of groups of people who live together a life of prayer. So monastic groups. I'm really thinking of monks, nuns, and these are in not every tradition, but in a lot of different traditions. There's intentional communities of people who live together to pray, or meditate. So that can be, again, that can be Buddhists, that can be yogis, that can definitely be Christians. From ancient times to today, in many different traditions around the world, many of these intentional communities, maybe most of them, have several set times of blessing or prayer throughout the day. And this is true too for people who live in families or as individuals who live lives of prayer. So, we know in Islam there's 5 times a day, at least the 5 times a day that you pray. In Jewish life too, there's blessings for every kind of thing that you do throughout the day. So there's lots of different traditions of prayer that help sort of punctuate our day with moments of prayer. And in earlier Christian tradition, this practice in monastic communities was not just in monastic community, in households as well. It could be called the divine office or the liturgy of the hours. And in medieval European communities, I'm just saying this because at one point, I traveled in Europe. I was a student in Europe for a little while. And well, even in the countryside, I grew up in the country here in the US, out in a rural area at some of the time. But, the ringing of church bells at certain times, people didn't have individual clocks or individual watches, right? So the community temple or church or whatever would ring a bell at certain, that's how you would know what time it was. But not only that, but people would pause and pray. They would have a certain prayer they would say at, a certain time of day, even if they were out in the field working at their own home. It wasn't just monks and nuns, so I don't want to say that it was. So close. Anyway, so this liturgy of the hours, that's one way of doing it. And there's many other prayer traditions that kind of give us different things throughout the day that we can think about and pray about. We give thanks for whatever's going on at a given time, or ask for God's help, or just kind of be aware of how God is with us no matter what we're doing at a specific moment throughout the day. Closer to our own times, the resistance movement, the resistance against Nazism, the movement of students and scholars in a multi-generational, multi-gender, intentional community, led by Dietrich Bonhoeffer at Finkenwalde in 1930s Germany, in the Confessing Church. I don't know if you're familiar with all that. It's relevant to our times. People banded together to practice their faith and resist fascism. And they prayed together. They prayed this liturgy of the hours. They practiced the divine office. They broke periodically throughout the day, just as if they were an ancient monastic community. And it was one of the things that strengthened their faith to collectively and individually resist Nazism. And if you know about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he followed that path of resistance all the way to he was executed by the Nazis in a concentration camp. So this kind of prayer, this was ordinary prayer. This was mental and vocal prayer. And so I'm just sharing that to say this is a kind of prayer that can really strengthen us to do important faithful things in difficult times. The Liturgy of the Hours breaks the day into the office of readings, which contains a hymn, 3 psalms, a reading from scripture, and a reading from a saint or some other church writer or devotional writer. morning prayer, mid-morning, midday, mid-afternoon prayer, and evening prayer. So that's usually the simple Christian tradition of this, but you can, if you're familiar with some other traditions, then you can see that there's a lot of overlap and connection with the way people in other faith traditions also divide up their day and punctuate it with prayer. The written prayer book for this practice is sometimes historically referred to as the breviary, meaning breviary brief, a book of brief, shortened versions of prayers, biblical readings, and writings of saints. So instead of us having recite all the Psalms at once, or being overwhelmed, which Psalm do I say? The breviary selects certain ones that have a similar theme to recite throughout a particular day. Instead of reading the book of Job as a whole, which is a pretty long book, it's 40 plus chapters, just one episode from it is chosen in the breviary. So you would just get little selections, little morsels, bite-sized pieces of your hymns and your psalms and your scripture to punctuate your day as you're going about your day. And then a prayer that helps us reflect on the meaning of that passage. When a saint's feast is celebrated in this tradition, often the divine office contains original writings of that saint or prayers of the saint, like we started off this chapter with a prayer by Teresa of Avila. Shared prayer books like these breviaries, which most of us don't use anymore, but the lectionary, that's a sort of, it could be a 1 year or a 3 year guide depending on your tradition, that breaks up the entire Bible into readings over the course of the year. And churches in a certain tradition will be preaching from the same scriptures every week, or the Book of Common Prayer, that's in the Episcopalian and Anglican tradition. The Book of Blessings, many different types of books of blessings in Jewish tradition and in many other traditions. Those kinds of books are ways. I've heard some people say, but I don't get to choose my own scripture or my own prayer or whatever. It might, for some folks, it feels very ritualized and maybe rigidly disciplined in a way that's not open to the spontaneity of spirit of your personal prayer life. So that's one way to look at it. But another way to look at it is that these kinds of books do help us connect in prayer with other people around the world across history, knowing that they've been used in the same way in the same seasons by people who are no longer here. And knowing that we can know when we're praying those things, if we want to, if we choose to use those can be tools of prayer that help us know that we're sharing the same experience of prayer with other people around the world on the same day, or at different points in history. Even though we're separated by time and space, we're still praying together in some sense. The second kind of prayer is prayer of recollection. So it's still connected to this first stage of mental prayer. It's still a kind of a mental prayer. But Teresa often emphasizes how it could be a second stage of its own that leads to, or kind of segues to, the deeper, less active prayer of quiet that's we're going to explore next as a third stage of prayer. This prayer of recollection, this transitional kind of prayer from the active mental prayer we just looked at to the quiet meditation we're going to next, is a way, this prayer of recollection is a way to separate us from our own strength and cling, as Teresa said, cling to the robe of God. The prayer opens one's soul and prepares one to meet God in truth and be open to the false self and personal idolatry in the presence of God's love. In other words, praying this way, I kind of do a personal inventory and start to realize I may be a little bit more focused on me than I am on God when I'm praying. And then just by noticing, I'm not noticing that so I can beat myself up and be mean to myself. When I take notice of that, when I recollect that or remember that or realize that with my mind, then I can surrender that and I can say, okay, well, that's not really, looking at me is not really what I'm trying to get to in prayer ultimately. So I'm going to just notice that I did that, and now I'm going to let that go and look at God's love again. I'm going to try to connect with that. So that's why we kind of look at prayer of recollection as sort of, it is kind of a transitional sort of prayer between these two ways of praying. For example, in the prayer of recollection, we might start out by affirming our own limitations. We could start out by saying, I'm praying in this time, this space. I'm confined to this body and this mind here and now. Those are some limitations I bring to this moment of prayer. But then I move on, or we move on, to affirm the reality of our soul's true identity. That, okay, yes, I'm in this body and I'm in this time and space, and I'm also created for union with God. I'm also created by God. I'm also connected to God all the time. So we start to affirm that reality. And in the prayer of recollection, we in general, we are examining our current relationship with God and trying to open ourselves to the possibility of being attentive to God in silence, of dropping the words and dropping the self-consciousness and just being. So that's the transition that we experience in that second stage. The third stage or experience of prayer is prayer of quiet. And now Teresa sometimes just calls this the second stage of prayer because for her, the vocal and mental prayer that we talked about first and that prayer of recollection that I just talked about, they're both very mental and they both take a lot of the mind's working in both those forms of prayer. So for her, those have a lot in common, but this other kind of prayer, this prayer of quiet, there's no mental effort required anymore. It's not dependent on us as human beings. So prayer of quiet, but in some traditions is called contemplation or contemplative prayer. Many mystics and many faith traditions and spiritual practices have described this contemplative prayer state. It could be also called meditation. Although Teresa has been considered perhaps the leading expert on this form of prayer, along with her student John of the Cross, by many Christians, we can learn much from each other when we're open to the experiences, insights, and community that those who practice other contemplative traditions have to share. And especially for those of us that get asked not to pray with other Christians anymore because of our gender identity or because of our same-sex partner or same-sex love that we feel when we do have those romantic connections. In other words, for whatever reason, if you can no longer pray with the community of your tradition and you're still trying to live a life of prayer and you're still trying to live a life of service, I have certainly been grateful that people in many other traditions are open at times, in certain times and spaces, to share their contemplative prayer life or their meditation. So go where the love is, share meditation where we can meditate together, and I can pray to the God of my understanding, as long as they're okay with that I'm doing my thing on my cushion or on my mat and they're doing theirs. I never be disrespectful about that, of course. So make sure that it's okay that you're doing that. But be that as it may, when we come together and meditate and we're each practicing the traditions that we bring, almost like a potluck, it can be a very rich experience for everybody if we're doing that by mutual consent. So in shared contemplative prayer of quiet, no matter what our tradition, we can have a respite from the divisions and conflicts of this world. We can enjoy peace and rest in God's presence and with each other. In this prayer, God gives to the soul an intellectual knowledge of his presence and makes it feel that it really is in communication with him, although he does this in a somewhat obscure manner. And what Teresa means by that is it's kind of mysterious. We don't exactly know how God works in our meditation because we're not trying to micromanage it. We're not trying to control the prayer experience anymore. God does what God is going to do. So and then the last kind of prayer is a prayer of union, sometimes called higher contemplation. And this is again, it's kind of a blurry boundary there. Is it still the same thing as contemplative prayer and meditation? Is it really a distinct experience, or is it just kind of a more intense experience of contemplation? So it's not a rigid difference at all. But this experience of union is very rare, and it's so passive. There's no effort at all by the human being who's experiencing this. That's why sometimes Teresa says seems to be kind of a separate stage. And I will say she's not unique in that. In other traditions as well, like let's say the 8 limbs of yoga, that last final stage of union, it is singled out sometimes as a unique stage. It's one that the other ones flow into and are deeply interconnected with, but it's kind of the culmination of what we might be seeking to experience in prayer or meditation. So this experience is well known to those of other traditions as the ultimate goal of all devoted meditation and service. And as before, Teresa and her student John of the Cross are the primary authorities on this state of prayer in the Christian tradition. This form of prayer is even more intuitive and passive than any other. It's a gift or grace, rather than something humans can achieve through our own exertions. The basic contemplative prayer practice of quiet meditation can sometimes be an entry into this prayer of union. Not always. We can never, Teresa emphasized, and so did John, but I think everybody really who teaches this kind of forewarns, cautions us about this. It's not something we can make happen. It's just, and if we don't experience it, it's not because we're doing something wrong and, we need to try harder. Trying harder is the opposite of experiencing this. So it only can happen if we really let go, surrender, and if it happens, it happens. Teresa described ever-deepening degrees of union, rarely experienced but possible, from spiritual quiet, when the imagination is still somewhat free, to full union, which can include personal effort of varying degrees, and finally, ecstasy or rapture. And that one is involuntary. In that one, the human will is entirely passive and just receiving from God, receiving God's love. In Buddhism and other Indian traditions, this is the bliss of melting into oneness with all that is. And in some tradition, that is understood as melting into the divine, being one with the divine. Last, I'll just quickly conclude with, I offer in the text version of this, the book version that I'm reading to you. This chapter concludes with a quick comparative guide for easy reference later. So it's a list of little points, So first kind of prayer, mental, is like a well, requires much effort to draw water, includes ordinary prayer, mental prayer, prayer of recollection, letting go of pride and humility, greatest amount of labor, faithful in the midst of discouragement, meditating on the life of Jesus, saints, spiritual heroes, using pictures, readings to aid prayer. Okay, so focus objects. And I know I added to that too when I was talking with you about it. That could also be musical aids or, auditory aids like mantras, chants, drums, anything that helps you focus. The point is, this kind of prayer, you're using all your senses just to help you focus your mind on God. Second kind of prayer, mental recollection, which in turn leads to prayer of quiet. So the second kind of prayer, mental recollection, is like a water wheel. There's less effort to draw water than from a well. So this one, water wheel, I know that's not as familiar for some of us that live in more urban settings, but if you've seen like a mill, it's like that. It's the water wheel, like a paddle wheel kind of thing. So it's less, it still takes effort, but less effort than drawing water from a well by hand. In prayer of recollection, the second kind of prayer, we're letting go of intellect. We avoid intellectual meditation or the noise of our minds, including readings. So in the second form, since we're trying to get quiet in the mind, we don't read. This second kind of prayer is the one that can grow and shrink. It will come and go with dry spells, but when it comes, it is in abundance. So again, think of that water wheel. So she said you might be like, it might not be a lot of water for a long while, but when it does come, it's like waterfalls. The soul doesn't get tired in this form of prayer, and we know it's from God because of the fruit it bears in us. In other words, if we're spending time in this kind of prayer and really feeling refreshed by God, and finding that we can do acts of service, we're more compassionate, we're more patient, those kind of things that don't maybe come up naturally in our character. I mean, you know yourself best, but if you know what your struggles are, and you're finding, for some reason I'm just finding myself to be much more refreshed and much more acting in the way I think that I want to be with other people and that I believe God wants me to be, then that's the spiritual fruit, right? That fruit is being born, and that kind of is evidence to you that your prayers are sincere, that this is that what's refreshing you really is God, that it's really spirit, that it's good stuff for you because it's doing good things and through you, good things for other people and creatures. Right? The third kind of prayer, contemplative meditation, the prayer of quiet, the one that leads to a sense of union. Along with the fourth stage of prayer, this is higher contemplation sometimes. So again, the boundaries between these are murky, right? So they're not like clear steps or stages. They're more like blurred lines or watercolor that bleeds into each other. Like a brook or a stream, this one requires you only to help direct the channels into which the water flows. So if you know the St. Francis prayer, make me a channel of thy peace, that's very much a sort of third kind of prayer, contemplative kind of prayer, when you're trying to be that channel or clear a channel for the water to flow through you. The soul isn't quite sure what's going on, but it's conscious of works or service, kind of aware of, like I just talked about last time, if you're kind of thinking about, is this prayer, how's this going for me, and you're looking at what fruit is it producing, and you're seeing some, that kind of thinking, that kind of self-examination, that could be, part of your awareness of what's going on. Your virtues become stronger, your soul recognizes changes, good changes in yourself and in your relationships, and it's the most definite. You're very certain. In other words, it's a definite sense of union of your whole soul with God. There's a sense of unconsciously doing something great. Maybe there's not a sense of it, but what it is unconsciously you're doing that thing of that connecting with God. You're aware of being spoken to, but it's different from the prayer of recollection. You don't, in this stage, you don't necessarily try to control whether or not your soul, as she calls it, moves or stirs. Like in the second stage, sometimes it feels so sweet to be connected to God that in the second stage you might be like, oh, I just don't want this prayer to stop, it feels so good, and that sounds great, right? I mean, a lot of us would love to get to that point in our prayer life, but when those moments are happening and we're still trying to steer the ship, so to speak, we're still trying to control whether that's happening or not. Or she's saying in this third stage, we're so surrendered now that we're just like, if we're not feeling that sweetness anymore, if our mind starts to wander, we're in that state that, like Neem Karoli Baba was talking about, that, okay, you know what, I'm angry, I'm lethargic, I'm distracted, okay, and just be with it, and then just keep going. You're not trying to control it, you're just noticing it. In this third stage, God instructs the soul through visions, not so much words. So you might see images in your mind, you might notice smells, you might, whatever sensations you may have, they will be less, maybe less mentally focused, right? Not so much that you're trying to think about words or focus on words. So again, images could come to your mind. Feelings could come to your mind. This is a stage of prayer where your wishes, your truths, things that are true for you, mysteries, things like that, things that really deep truths for you might come to the surface. You might become aware of things that you've been pushing away a long time, or have insights that you've never had before, sort of a spiritual vision, right? So that gets, it's you're more open to that in this stage of prayer. In this stage of prayer, God imparts knowledge to the soul, and you don't even feel a sense of doubt about it. It just feels very clear and powerful and right, and in a deep way. I don't mean in a power over way, like you're going to lord it over someone else. I'm not trying to say it like that. I'm saying like in this really deeply rooted way, you have a sense of, and just trust in God's truth, and in this one as well, God is listening. God is listening by the spiritual effect you feel in this prayer, by feelings of love and faith. So this, going back to the spiritual fruits again, this is that prayer of quiet is one where who you are in your relationships with other people and navigating life with all its troubles and conflicts and all that, you may feel all those things, those bumps in the road are still going to be there, but the feelings of love and faith you have in terms of your deeper connection with God and even your deeper connection with other people, those are what guide your actions, right? So it's not that I just want to reassure, it's not that you don't feel things or have bumps in the road. It's that spiritually you're nourished by a love and faith that's still with you, even in spite of those more superficial currents of emotion and disturbance. We're probably going to I know we're going to get deeper into this in the other chapters. This is actually a really short section and I'm getting wordy. It's not written like this at all. Fourth kind of prayer is mystical rest, prayer of union. Along with the third stage of prayer, it's also higher contemplation. And this one is where God does all the work. This is like rain is falling on you. That's the living water is just rain that falls on you. It waters you without any effort by you at all. And she even describes this as non-consensual rapture, which does not sound like a good thing in our day and age. I probably need to change the wording on that. So it's not that it's non-consensual because you have chosen to pray. You do want union with God, so you've given consent in that sense. The part of it, I think maybe, I don't know. I'm going to take that word out. Sorry about that. What she was trying to say, and of course this was written in Spanish too, and so that could also be a bad translation. But what she's saying is God's doing all the work here and giving pleasure, ecstasy to the lover of God. The person praying is just swept away in ecstasy and has given consent because this person came to God in prayer to have connection. The part that would overwhelm Teresa in describing this experience would be just more that she didn't expect it to be that intense. I'll leave it at that. All right, so I'll just call that rapture from now on instead of that other part. It's passive, so she would have a sense in this kind, this is emerging out of the prayer of quiet. So already you're passive, you're receiving God's love, but even more, you're not even sort of having to quiet yourself anymore. You really just are quiet. You're completely passive. She describes it as irresistible, as just overcoming, sort of quickly, a sense of being overcome by love, desire, really feeling disconnected from the things of the world, including the body and the physical world, longing to see God. I think this is actually different than, I'm going to need to rewrite this. So Teresa's describing a unique experience that she had. So when she would have these feelings, she would also have a certain amount of loneliness and distress, wanting to be even closer to God or wanting this moment not to end. She talked about how it would last only a moment, but to her it seemed like it could have been days or hours. And the soul is rejoicing in bliss and not feeling any physical suffering. She was a person that had a lot of physical suffering, chronic pain and illness, but in these moments of rapture, she would feel no physical pain or emotional pain at all. But she described a thing that I don't know how common this is, but she described just a feeling of when she would be coming out of those times to really feel sad, lonely, distressed, that I didn't want that to end. Like, that was so beautiful. I'm ready to just leave the body now and just be one with God all the time, and transition out of this worldly life into that next experience of being with God. So, I know there are people in every tradition that experience that. I don't know how many of us are pursuing having that part of this experience. She shares it just to kind of, I guess, as a caution to us that when you're deep in mystical prayer, when you're deep in contemplative prayer, this could happen. This is one of the things, and I mentioned it earlier, the things that happen in the fourth stage of prayer. She was very clear that like these are things that are very rare, any of them, but any one of these experiences is even more rare. Like even if you experience one of these things, it doesn't mean you're going to experience all of these things, right? So anyway, so we don't spend a whole lot of time in the fourth stage of prayer here, because it's not something you can practice. It's something you can learn about and maybe try to prepare yourself to be aware of, and not focus over much on the passing parts of it. Like if you have a moment of mystical sweetness, getting hung up on but I don't want it to end, and I want to go be in the next way of experiencing God. Like, how am I trying to say this? It's good to be aware of it, but just so that we don't get stuck in it, I guess. Some of the rough edges that it might have because of our interpretations or reactions to it. But anyway, so we'll be looking mostly at the other three forms of prayer because those are things we can practice. And with that said, I will stop, and I promise you those pages are actually not as long as I made them. So if you ever want to read it or it will not be as laborious as I made it. But anyway, so tomorrow we'll look at Lectio Divina, and we'll get to do one of the practices of mental prayer. Okay, that's it.